Hello and welcome to DM It All, a show where we talk about D&D books and tabletop gaming history. In this episode, we'll be discussing The Village of Hommlet, another Gary Gygax module. Our previous episodes on Gygax books were focused on unique novelties, but Hommlet is his take on a more typical adventure. Gary Gygax began developing Hommlet in the mid-1970s for his home group. This was his follow-up to his original Castle Greyhawk campaign. Castle Greyhawk was created to beta test the D&D rules, with no plans for publishing the adventure. Hommlet, on the other hand, was being developed with an official release in mind. Another striking difference was that Castle Greyhawk focused on one massive super dungeon, while Hommlet would detail some of the surrounding world. Hommlet was eventually published in 1979 as TSR's 9th module. It was meant for level 1 adventurers, which made it an introduction point to D&D for many players. We mentioned in our Dragonlance review how early D&D modules were mostly sandbox adventures, consisting of a town and a nearby dungeon. That status quo was largely set up by Hommlet and the Keep on the Borderlands, another Gygax module. While Keep was created as a potential starting point for any custom campaign, Hommlet, on the other hand, was always meant to be a setup for a sequel module. Even the cover describes Hommlet as a lead-in to a future adventure known as the Temple of Elemental Evil. But most people that ran Hommlet back in the day never played the Temple of Elemental Evil. We'll explain why that is when we cover that book, but for this episode, we'll simply be analyzing Hommlet as most people experienced it, as a standalone adventure. As always, there will be spoilers for the module in this walkthrough. If you want to avoid them and get straight to our final thoughts, jump to the time shown here. The village of Hommlet itself is a standard village for the most part, but the landmarks nearby are what make it notable. Mainly, the neighboring town of Nulb and the aforementioned Temple of Elemental Evil. Where Hommlet was built at an important crossroads, Nulb was created in a much more remote location. Because of this, Nulb was often overlooked by most local authorities, allowing the town to develop as a haven for shady individuals. The bandits and thieves that gathered at Nulb eventually began attacking the surrounding areas. The raids started off fairly small, but their scope rapidly expanded when an evil cleric arrived at the village. This cleric built the chapel that would later become the Temple of Elemental Evil. The core concept of Elemental Evil, for those that don't know, is that the elements are inherently quote-unquote evil in the eyes of man. While elemental creatures in D&D are generally classified as neutral, an argument could be made that the elemental forces of nature pose a threat to humanity. Mankind is constantly at the whims of fires, floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. The best we can do is play defensive against these cataclysmic forces. So from our perspective, the elements are evil, and so are those that worship their destructive power. The allure of this destructive power was used by the temple to rally together the forces of evil and wage war on the neighboring civilians. Innocent people were enslaved and tortured as the land itself began to die from pestilence. After 3 years of this nightmare, the forces of good from neighboring cities retaliated with a large-scale army. The temple was bombarded and fell within a fortnight. Then, the ruins of the temple and whatever lurked inside were sealed away with powerful magics. Adventurers came to this area over the next 5 years to clean up any leftover brigands. Hommlet enjoyed 4 years of peace after that, before the bandit raids started up again. Presently, the villagers in Hommlet fear that these new raids are a sign of the temple's resurrection. They have sent pleas to the surrounding areas for help, and that is where the party comes in. The player characters are assumed to be another pack of fortune seekers, which is common for most old school adventures. If you want a good plot hook or anything more than a semblance of plot, you'll probably be disappointed with most modules from this era. For better or worse, most adventures back then were foremost concerned with detailing locations. Most games were run as open sandboxes, and plots manifested through gameplay interaction. You basically bought modules to get the maps and the map information, and Hommlet was a pretty great choice if that's all you needed. The village itself is well detailed and contains most of the things you'd expect within a town. If your players want to know about the local banker or Wainwright, the module provides that information. There are even maps for some of the interior locations like the local inn, village church, trading post, and even a guard tower. Some of these maps were later updated for Hommlet's sequel to look more three-dimensional. The ironic thing is that for all the detail Gygax gives to the village, he doesn't give much reason to interact with it. There really isn't anything pre-written to do in Hommlet, and the party can ignore most of the village altogether. The module fleshes out many of the villagers, but they often don't have much of value to offer the party. Most of the NPC information just describes their homes, families, occupations, and belongings, or, treasure to certain player characters. It might be interesting to learn about the alcoholic village elder or the bossy spinster in town, but this information has no practical use. Blackgate, for example, is a retired warrior who doesn't like people being near his property. His rough personality developed after the death of his wife and child, but there is no obvious way for the players to even learn about this tragic backstory. The NPCs are really more like set pieces, and it's up to the DM and the players to figure out how to use them. Some side quests and relationships will come up naturally through conversation, but there will need to be some additional planning by the Dungeon Master to utilize these characters well. This is made even more apparent by the fact that most of the villagers don't even have names. Gygax liked to leave NPC names up to the Dungeon Master, so they could customize the module for themselves. This concept is also present in Keep on the Borderlands, and it's to remind DMs that they shouldn't use the book directly as written. Gygax also makes mention of staging battles in town, and that the DM should keep track of buildings destroyed during the campaign. However, there are no pre-planned large-scale fights in this book, so it's clear the DM is expected to cook up some scuffles in the street. Not only are side quests up to DM discretion, but so is the main plot. Gygax merely delivers the module's backstory in the opening paragraphs, without any advice on how to deliver it to the players. The module doesn't even specify how the party should discover the nearby dungeon. All these issues pose no problem for veteran dungeon masters, but newbies would be better off tackling something that provides way more direction. We'd be remiss not to mention that there are a few NPCs in town that are actually important to the overall plot. Most of them were even player characters from Gygax's original Hommlet campaign. This module's adventure is an alternate reality to that beta test version. It's not a sequel because the original campaign was derailed pretty hard by Rob Kuntz and his evil fighter named Robilar. Robilar basically made a mockery of the entire adventure and helped the forces of evil win. Remember when we mentioned how the forces of good sealed the Temple of Elemental Evil with powerful magics? Robilar basically unsealed the temple and released all the evil back into the world, including the final boss. Which is a pretty good example of why you should generally avoid having evil characters in your party, unless you and your party prefer that kind of chaos. Anyway, in this version of Hommlet, the most important NPCs are the two leaders of the local religions. The more established villagers worship Druidism, but a church of St. Cuthbert was erected fairly recently. St. Cuthbert himself is a lawful neutral deity that despises evil. His main focuses are in law and retribution. Gygax created Cuthbert as a somewhat comedic divine entity who converted non-believers with a whack of his cudgel. The walls of this church feature images of St. Cuthbert, as well as some of his colorful teachings. Some examples include, "Square corners can be pounded smooth," "Thick heads are not made of glass," and "Salvation is better than smart answers." This church was built for a cleric of St. Cuthbert known as Canoness Yide. Yide had played a crucial role against the Temple of Elemental Evil and was installed to lead this new church, but she has mysteriously gone missing. The current leader of the church is an unfriendly man named Turjon, and is viewed with suspicion by local villagers. Turjon is not a bad person though, it's just that he would rather be out adventuring instead of passing out the collection plate. The people within the church as a whole will frequently demand donations in exchange for aid. This is also true for the town's druid, Jeru Ashstaff. Jeru is actually an undercover agent for the druids in the nearby gnarly woods. Jeru's job is to monitor the local area and deduce whether the Temple of Elemental Evil is indeed making a comeback. While druids are usually all about nature and its elements, they likely didn't appreciate all the death and pestilence the temple had brought to the land. But it's not just the forces of good that have spies sneaking around. The town's local traders, Ranos and Grimag, are both spies for the Temple of Elemental Evil. If that's not bad enough, the kicker is that these guys are also terrible vendors. They mark up most of the goods they sell, and rare items are likely to be faulty. Any horses bought through them will tire easily, and their attack dogs will run off after being purchased. If the party seeks revenge on these two, they should know that Ranos is a level 10 thief, and Grimag is a level 7 assassin. So the newly arrived level 1 party should be super wary of taking them head on. A useful pro tip for Gygax modules in general is to be very careful who you pick fights with. The party will eventually discover that there is a new castle being built in Hommlet. This castle is the future home of Burn, a level 8 magic user, and Rufus, a level 6 fighter. This pair of adventurers have been protecting Hommlet for the past 3 years, and the Church of St. Cuthbert is building this castle as a sign of their gratitude. The duo can be recruited by the party, but they'll demand a sizable chunk of any treasure acquired. Because of that, the party is probably better off recruiting some of the less expensive and lower level NPCs at the local inn. This inn is called the Welcome Wench, and it has several potential party members. It's key to remember that characters in AD&D were a lot more fragile, and that parties needed NPC allies to increase their chances of victory. The mercenaries available in Hommlet can only be purchased through the corrupt trading post and the evil spies that run it, so the party will need one of the NPCs in the Welcome Wench if they want reliable meat shields to protect them. One solid choice is Elmo, the Village Drunk. Elmo is a level 4 ranger that will join the party as long as it gets his ale money. And honestly, this is a pretty convincing cover story, because Elmo in actuality is an agent for Verbabonk, one of the cities involved in the first war against the temple. Like the druids, the nearby cities have their own spies to keep tabs on the happenings of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Inside the Welcome Wench, the party might also meet a thief named Furnock in one room, and a magic user named Spinor in another. Even though Furnock is a member of the literal thief class, it's Spinor the party should look out for. Spinor will call dibs on any magic scrolls that the party happens to find, and if the party doesn't recruit him, Spinor will start following them in secret. He'll then swipe items from the party whenever the opportunity arises. Well, that's bad enough. Spinor is not the worst possible ally though. There's also a level 2 fighter named Zert who will eventually reveal himself as a temple spy. But the biggest mistake would be recruiting Cobort and Turiko, a low-level fighter and monk team that only comes as a pair. These men are not temple spies, but they are greedy bastards who want easy money. Like Spinor, this pair will shadow the party in secret if they are not accepted into the group. Unlike Spinor though, these guys have no qualms about stealing the party's treasure right off their fresh corpses. They will wait for the party to finish a particularly difficult fight, and then strike when everyone is at their weakest. Have we mentioned that Gygax has a bit of a cruel streak? The dungeon for this adventure is the ruins of a Moathouse located in a nearby swamp. This Moathouse was actually an outpost for the Temple of Elemental Evil back during the temple's heyday. The Moathouse was destroyed after the temple's collapse, but evil forces are already flocking back to it. The Moathouse makes for a strange base of operations since it's basically swarming with wild animals. This includes abnormally large animals such as giant frogs, giant arachnids, giant rats, and giant lizards. There's even a giant crayfish in the basement dungeon. Soldiers from the temple actually just stick to the dungeon beneath the rubble of the Moathouse above, but there is an unrelated group of bandits hiding out in the actual ruins. We have to admit, it doesn't make much sense why these people would squat in such a dangerous place if they're not associated with the people living just one floor below. This area is teeming with monsters, and the giant snake here even ate one of the bandits in the past. The group is likely to run away when the party arrives, but that begs the question of why this cowardly lot was hanging out here in the first place. Anyway, if the party takes the stairs down to the dungeon level, they will find themselves in a prison area. There are no living prisoners here, however, as the place is infested with zombies. The party can rescue some civilians in a nearby room, but they will have to make it past an ogre that's guarding the only visible way forward. There are some temple uniforms the party can disguise themselves with, but the ogre will still attack if they don't also display the secret greeting. If the party wants to avoid the beefy ogre, there's an alternate secret path available in the prison area. Unfortunately, this secret path leads to the nearby crypts where 4 ghouls are waiting. Ghouls get 3 attacks per round and have a chance to paralyze opponents with each hit, so pick your poison. The crypt area eventually leads to a series of interconnecting tunnels, but these narrow pathways don't actually go anywhere. They stretch on forever and are only here to get the player lost. To reach the final area, the party will actually have to head in the opposite direction. If the party runs into a wandering monster while exploring, there's a decent chance of it being a false alarm. Several random encounters are just the party misinterpreting minor events like the wind blowing, or objects shifting nearby. This is a nice touch for adding atmosphere and keeping the tension going. The main enemies in this area though are bugbears and gnolls. The bugbears will immediately attack, but the gnolls are willing to parley. If the party gives them some gold, the gnolls will take it and just leave. They may also direct the party to the location of their master's quarters. The hallway before the master's room is occupied by a group of temple soldiers. This squad consists of 6 guardsmen and their level 2 sergeant. If attacked, this group will call for a backup squad within 4 rounds. There will also be a 3rd squad that hangs back with the master to prepare their defenses. These soldiers are reinforced by a level 4 lieutenant as well as the final boss himself, making it 23 enemies in total. So basically this will be a brutal fight if the party just charges in while hacking and slashing. The party will need a plan before revealing themselves, and they shouldn't be afraid of falling back if needed. The final boss is a level 5 cleric known as Llyryth the Beautiful, and he is not an unreasonable man. He wants to restore the temple to its former glory, and he is willing to accept the party as new recruits. If the party decides to join up, they will help Llyryth in the bandit raids that his men perform on the surrounding areas. This job would involve more than just larceny though, because Llyryth never leaves any survivors. If the party goes down this route, Llyryth might also just kill them in their sleep. This is his way of dealing with suspicious recruits, as well as recruits who are too good at their job. He doesn't need the competition after all. If the party instead decides to fight him, Llyryth will offer a ransom for his life when things turn sour, and this isn't a choice that should be handled lightly. Llyryth is favored very highly within the Temple of Elemental Evil, and the temple leaders will seek out the people who killed him. If the party brags about their victory back in town or starts wearing some of Llyryth's gear, the forces of evil will take notice. They will then send a level 10 assassin after Llyryth's killers within 3 weeks. Jeru the town druid is level 7, while Turgon is a level 6 cleric of St. Cuthbert. These 2 high-level NPCs will be willing to protect the party, but only if they're made aware of the threat. So like any Gary Gygax module, there is a killer trap waiting to spring on the protagonists. Except here the trap is your reward for completing the dungeon. So, hooray! It's common for modern players to wonder what is so special about the Village of Hommlet. Since Hommlet helped set the standard for low-level adventures, a lot of later modules took what Hommlet accomplished and improved on it. Some gave more reason to interact with the village, while others just expanded the more exciting adventuring portions. Hommlet is surprisingly thinner than most TSR modules, containing only 15 pages of text, while most of their other adventures have around 25. Later modules also gave way more direction to the Dungeon Master in terms of running the adventure. The real selling points of Hommlet are the maps and the amount of detail within the village itself. Hommlet is one of the best home bases in AD&D, and that's because it truly feels like a living town. Even if the DM is not interested in using the nearby dungeon, they can just use the village portion on its own. Many modules have abstract or non-existent towns, so Hommlet serves well as a default home base. The dungeon portion of this adventure is also pretty solid too. It contains most of what you would expect in a low-level dungeon, but it also has great monster variety as well as some memorable encounters. This means that the party can have fun with this module even if they end up having very little interaction with the local villagers. Like the Village Hommlet, the Moathouse is a great option to replace more generic dungeons too, should the need arise. Though this module may give very little advice on how the adventure should progress, in some ways that's the advantage of this module. Since there's not much of a script, it's easy to change, adjust, and omit particular details. The party and Dungeon Master get to decide how much they want to get out of an adventure like this, which is what has allowed Hommlet to stand up on its own, outside of the looming shadow of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Thank you for watching DM It All. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, and subscribe. Also make sure to ring the bell if you want to be updated on all our upcoming videos. If you enjoyed this video in particular, then hopefully you'll be excited for our next follow-up video, where we'll be looking at the treacherous Temple of Elemental Evil. While you wait for that video, let us know what you think about the Village of Hommlet down below. Do you ever run this module? And if you did, do you think it still holds up? Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you all next session. Because Elmo in actuality is an agent for what?